In this lecture, we will be introducing the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, books which together can be called new beginnings after the exile. And my name is Dr. Joe Sprinkle. Now, Jews went into exile at various times. In 605 BC, Daniel and his friends went to exile, according to Daniel chapter 1 and verse 1. Around 598, 597, King Jehoiachin and his entourage went into exile, according to Jeremiah chapter 52. And we've mentioned in our archaeology section that we have a Babylonian rationalist that mentions Jehoiachin in exile. And then after the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC, many more go into exile. Jeremiah predicts that there would be a 70-year Babylonian captivity. That's Jeremiah 25, 1 through 11. And this is an approximate number, in part because Jews don't go into exile all at the same time, and Jews don't come back from exile all at the same time. But certainly it was an indication that those that went, especially early on, would be there for a lifetime. Now, not all Jews were exiles. Some fled to Egypt. Jeremiah and some Jews along with him did that. Some stayed, though life was hard, and it was hard for the Jews to flourish in Judah. More stayed than went. But the ones exiled were the leaders, the upper classes, the craftsmen, and that left those who stayed behind in a very difficult situation. The effects of the exile on the Jews. One, it was the beginning of the diaspora. After a few generations, there ended up being more Jews outside the land than within the land of Judah. And indeed, it's true today that there's more Jews outside of the land of Israel than there are Jews within Israel. Another result of the exile is an adoption of a new language, Aramaic. Parts of Ezra and Daniel are written in Aramaic. Some of the words of Jesus in the New Testament are in Aramaic. And the Jewish tradition in the Babylonian Talmud is mostly written in Aramaic rather than Hebrew. In the exile, they developed new forms of worship. Synagogues have developed by the 2nd century BC. And they also emphasized the law a great deal more after the exile, having gone into exile because they ignored the law. Well, they responded by going perhaps to the opposite extreme of an excessive emphasis on law. One of the effects of the exile was the end of polytheism. It was the Jewish religion that kept the Jewish people intact and distinct from the surrounding Gentile population. Those that adopted polytheistic practices ended up assimilating into the pagan populations, with only those that kept their pure monotheism remained distinct. And then it was during this period of time that you have the canonization of Scripture beginning to take full effect. So let's talk about the return from exile in Ezra and Nehemiah. A bit about the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. The book of Ezra is named after the main character in Ezra chapter 7 through 10. The book of Nehemiah is named after its main character, Nehemiah. There is a tradition of taking Ezra and Nehemiah as a separate book, and there's also a tradition of taking Ezra and Nehemiah as one book. The idea that they are separate books is found in the early church father Origen, who divided the book into two. Jerome, the translator of the Latin Vulgate, took the book as two books, supporting the idea that the books are separate. Both books have identical lists of things in Ezra chapter 2 and Ezra chapter 7, and it's odd that they would both have the same identical list if they were one work instead of two. If they were separate works, then you can understand that they might happen to repeat some information. But if they were one work, you'd expect it only to occur once. So that's an argument in favor of them being separate books. On the other hand, it's a little more likely that the books were originally one book. In the Hebrew Bible, there's no break between Ezra and Nehemiah, and the Masoretes give the verse count for both books at the end of Nehemiah. They're counting them as one book. Josephus's counting of the Hebrew books as 22 in his work Contra Oppion assumes Ezra Nehemiah counts as one book. The Babylonian Talmud, Baba Bathra 15a, regards the two books as a unity, with Ezra as the author. And in the Septuagint, the apocryphal Ezra occurs as first Esdras, and the canonical Ezra Nehemiah occurs as a single book, second Esdras. So there's a strong tradition of viewing them as one book as well. Now, who was the author of Ezra or Nehemiah or the combined Ezra Nehemiah? Well, Ezra is a candidate. The Talmud, Baba Bathra 15a, indicates Ezra was the author for Ezra and Nehemiah. But that doesn't explain why in some places it talks about Ezra in third person, while in other places Ezra speaks for himself in first person. And it also doesn't explain why you have first-person narratives by Nehemiah. Could Nehemiah be the author? But again, why third-person narratives about Nehemiah mixed in with the autobiographical first-person narrations? Also, a problem with Nehemiah is a mention of an event around 400 BC, as we'll see in a moment, which seems a bit late for either Ezra or Nehemiah to be the author. The likely view is that the author of Ezra and Nehemiah is the narrator, and it's at least possible that the narrator is the chronicler, the author of the Book of Chronicles. What you have here are different sources. Ezra wrote an autobiography. This is one source of the book of Ezra. Parts of the book, Ezra speaks for himself. I, Ezra, did this, and I, Ezra, did that. But that's introduced by a third-person narrator, which suggests that the narrator is different than Ezra. You get the same sort of thing in the book of Nehemiah, where Nehemiah speaks in first-person autobiographical style, but there is also a narrator that introduces that. And so it looks like there are two sources, the autobiography or memoir of Ezra and the memoir of Nehemiah. And then there are also other sources that are quoted, lists and letters that are interspersed throughout both books. And so the narrator is the likely person that assembled these sources, the memoirs of Ezra, the memoirs of Nehemiah, and these lists and letters to and from Persian officials, and put it all together. Now, this narrator could be the chronicler. At the very least, there's a close connection between the very end of 2 Chronicles and the beginning of Ezra in Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. They're word for word verbatim. That at least suggests that the chronicler could be the author of both works, of both Chronicles and the combined Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, as far as the date of Ezra and Nehemiah, well, the events recorded cover the period from around 539 to 430, but it does mention an event around 400 as well, at least in the final redaction of the book. The latest recorded event is in Nehemiah chapter 12, 10, and 11, which speaks of the ascension of Yeshua as high priest around 400 BC. And that would suggest that the book could not be completed until about 400 BC. Now, some critical scholars think that Ezra came under Artaxerxes II, while Nehemiah came under Artaxerxes I, which would mean that Ezra came after Nehemiah. But Ezra chapter 8 and verse 9 indicate that Ezra and Nehemiah are contemporaries. They show up at the same meeting where Ezra reads the law of the Lord before the people. And so to maintain this revisionist view, the text of Nehemiah 8 must be assumed without any evidence to be corrupt, or that the editor got confused when he put Ezra before Nehemiah. Neither one of these are likely, but it is true that some scholars in the critical tradition have suggested this. Well, let's look at the first return from exile. Cyrus's decree allowed this return from exile. It was led by Sheshbazzar, and we really don't know much about who Sheshbazzar is. The early leaders were Zerubbabel, who became the governor. He was of Davidic descent, and he's in the lineage of Jesus Christ. His name means seed of Babylon in Akkadian. So he was an exile who returned, had a Babylonian-type name. Another one that returned was Joshua, the high priest. Haggai and Zechariah also appear in the book and encourage the people to rebuild the temple of the Lord. In fact, that is the major activity of the first part of Ezra, is rebuilding the temple, which they succeed in doing from around the years 520 to 516 BC. It was thus completed 70 years after the first temple was destroyed in 586. And that's at least one way of counting Jeremiah's 70-year Babylonian captivity, from the destruction of the temple to its rebuilding. This is what Cyrus's decree has to say. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth and has appointed me to build a temple for him in Jerusalem in Judah. Any one of his people among you, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem in Judah and build the temple of the Lord, the God of Israel, the God who is in Jerusalem. And the people of any place where survivors may now be living are to provide him with silver and gold, with goods and livestock, and with freewill offerings for the temple of the God in Jerusalem. Now, who was Cyrus? Cyrus was the king of Persia. He became king of Persia around 558 BC. He expanded his kingdom when he conquered his grandfather. He had become prince of Persia by a marriage alliance in which Astyages' daughter was married into the Persian royal family. But he turned around and conquered and defeated his grandfather, Astyages, and thus became king in 550 BC of the Medo-Persian Empire. And then he conquered Babylon in a very important year for biblical chronology in 539 BC. And it was shortly after that that he issued this decree that we just read, allowing the Jews, anyone that wanted to return to Judah and Jerusalem and to rebuild the temple. Now, a little bit about the end of the Babylonian kingdom. The last king of Babylon was a man by the name of Nabonidus. You can see his years. He was defeated by Cyrus in 539. He was not very popular. In fact, he wasn't even in Babylon for some 10 years of his reign when he went 500 miles into the desert, into Saudi Arabia, to a place called Tama. While he was gone, his son Belshazzar was acting king. He was de facto king. In fact, Daniel refers to Belshazzar as king, though technically he was the crown prince. Now, why did Nabonidus go to Tama, 500 miles into the desert, as you can see on the map? Well, possibly to control spice trade routes from Sheba, Yemen, or possibly to worship his god Sin. Nabonidus' mother was a priestess of Sin. Perhaps he was doing something along those lines in Tama, where there's a shrine to Sin. We really don't know. But in any case, in 539, the Persians came and conquered Babylon and developed their own very large empire. You can see the extent of the Persian Empire at its greatest on the map here. Why did Cyrus allow the Jews to return from exile? Well, his motive was to win support from captive people. And this was his general policy, as a document that Cyrus himself wrote, the Cyrus Cylinder, indicates. The Cyrus Cylinder is a 9-inch clay cylinder. In it, it claims that Cyrus was welcomed by Babylon as a liberator from that wicked king Nabonidus. And he claims there that the god of Babylon, Marduk, had given him victory. Now, this is kind of similar if you go back to what he said to the Jews, where he said to them, "The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth." When he's talking to the Jews, he speaks in the name of the Lord, or Yahweh. But when he's speaking to the Babylonians, it was Marduk who gave him the victory. He was definitely a good politician in that regard. Ironically, it really was Yahweh who had given him victory. But anyway, he allowed various captive peoples to go home according to the Cyrus Cylinder. So not just the Jews, but other captive peoples were allowed to return home and rebuild their sanctuaries, and he also returned to them their national treasures. And so Cyrus was used by God to allow the Jews, in fulfillment of Jeremiah's prophecy, to return to the promised land. This is what the Cyrus Cylinder says in part. He, speaking of Marduk, scanned and looked through all the countries, searching for a righteous ruler to lead him in the New Year's procession, is the implication. He, Marduk, made him, referring to Cyrus, set out on the road to Babylon, going at his side like a real friend, as far as Ashur and Susa, Agade, Eshnunna, the towns of Zamban, Maturna, Der, as well as the region of Gutian. I return these sacred cities on the other side of the Tigris, the sanctuaries of which have been in ruins for a long time, the images which used to live therein, and established for them permanent sanctuaries. I also gathered all their former inhabitants and returned to them their habitations. Furthermore, I resettled upon the command of Marduk, the great lord, all the gods of Sumer and Akkad, whom Nabonidus had brought into Babylon to the anger of the Lord of the gods, unharmed in their former chapels, the places which make them happy. So that's what Cyrus said he did for non-Jews. He did something very similar for Jews. A little bit about Cyrus's decree in Ezra. It indicates that Cyrus did for the Jews what he did for others according to the Cyrus Cylinder. Again, he spoke in the name of Yahweh in Ezra, just as he spoke in the name of Marduk in Babylon. And it marks the official end to the Babylonian exile shortly after conquering Babylon in 539. So this allowed Joshua and Zerubbabel to return from exile, and Joshua came and assumed the role of high priest, and Zerubbabel became the governor, a governor of Davidic descent. Now, Joshua and Zerubbabel had problems with Proto-Samaritans in Ezra chapter 4, who, though they were really enemies of the Jews, said they wanted to help build a temple to Yahweh with the Jews. Zerubbabel and Joshua, together with the help of two prophets, the prophet Haggai and Zechariah, the same Haggai and Zechariah that wrote books in the Bible by those names. They got the people that had returned from exile to begin rebuilding the temple around 520 BC, and you'll read about that in Ezra chapters 5 and 6. And indeed, they did rebuild the temple, completing it from 520 BC to 516 BC. Ezra and Nehemiah describe then 3 returns from exile at 3 separate times. The first return from exile occurred in Ezra chapters 1 through 6, in the year 538 BC, led by Sheshbazzar, Zerubbabel, and Joshua. It was permitted by Cyrus's decree, who said as many as wished to could return and rebuild the temple, and this was at least partially financed by the royal treasury. And there were some 49,697 people that came back from exile at that time. And they began rebuilding the temple, sacrifices were made, the Feast of Tabernacles were celebrated, and that temple was completed by 516. But then in the rest of Ezra, you get a second return from exile in the year 458 BC, led by Ezra. Again, as many who wish could return, and finances were in part supplied by the Persian royal treasury. This return involved 1,758 people that returned, Jews that returned from exile. Ezra dealt with a problem of mixed marriages, that the Jews were intermarrying with pagans and thus undermining their distinctive existence as Jews, and he tried to put an end to that practice. But then there's a third return from exile described at the beginning of the book of Nehemiah, and that took place around 444 BC. It was led by Nehemiah. Both Ezra and Nehemiah came under King Artaxerxes. The probable interpretation is that both of them are Artaxerxes I, which is Longimanus. Nehemiah was allowed to rebuild the wall of Jerusalem that apparently had, shortly before he came, been torn down. The amount of people that returned with Nehemiah is unknown, but he came and rebuilt the wall of Jerusalem over the course of about 52 days, despite opposition from enemies Sanballat of Samaria and Tobiah of the Ammonites and Geshem of the Arabs. As it turns out, there's a big gap of time between Ezra chapter 6 and Ezra chapter 7, a gap of almost 60 years, 515 to 458. It's during those years that the story of the book of Esther takes place. And so I'm going to turn to the story of Esther at this point, in that gap between Ezra 6 and Ezra 7. Esther married the Persian monarch Xerxes. It's the same as the Ahasuerus of the Hebrew tradition. Both are versions of the nearly unpronounceable Persian name that I have written here, but I choose not to try to pronounce. The author of Esther is unknown, probably a Persian Jew. The date of the book, it was probably completed after the death of Xerxes, who died in 465. Esther 10:2 suggests that. There's some question over historicity. Liberal scholars tend to reject the historicity of Esther. They see the book as fictional. We who are conservative will defend the historicity of the book. The story of Esther. Esther is a Jewish girl that marries a Persian king, who we will call in the Hebrew Ahasuerus or Xerxes. And her relative is a man named Mordecai, who was an official in the Persian court. His enemy was a man named Haman, who hated the Jews and got Xerxes Ahasuerus to issue a decree to destroy all the Jews in his kingdom. Esther intervened to save the Jewish people from genocide. Now, Esther has a number of theological problems, the most important of which is the lack of any reference to God. There's no overt reference to God in the entire book, making this and Song of Songs the only two books of the Bible with no direct reference to God. There's also some questionable morality. For example, what's a nice Jewish girl like Esther doing in a harem of a Persian king? Wasn't it bad for Jews to marry pagans in general? Even if it were a king, wouldn't that still be bad in general? Why does she cooperate in this beauty contest to win the right to be the bride of the Persian king? Also, questionable morality is Esther's lack of mercy at the end of the book. Esther shows no mercy and insists on Haman being hanged. She presses for a decree to allow the Jews to slaughter and plunder their enemies. And Esther even extends the slaughter for an extra day beyond the original decree. And again, was she morally right in doing these things? At least it seems on the surface to be problematic. And then both Esther and Mordecai have what look like could be pagan names. Mordecai means man of Marduk. Esther may be related to the god Ishtar. But there are positive themes in Esther's theology as well. There's the theme of divine deliverance. God intervened using Esther to allow the Jewish people not to be destroyed by Haman and the Persian decree by Ahasuerus to destroy them. And although God is never mentioned by name in the book, he seems to be working behind the scenes, as you can see in many coincidences that are in the book. It just happened that Esther was selected to be queen. It just happened that Mordecai heard of a plot to assassinate Ahasuerus and warn the court about it. It just happened that the king couldn't sleep one night and wanted to reward Mordecai for what he did. And all these little coincidences added up to make it possible for Esther to intervene in order to save the Jewish people. And there's a hint of that in chapter 4 and verse 14, a hint of God's unseen providence, where Mordecai says to Esther, perhaps who knows? Perhaps it was for a time such as this that you have risen to queenship. And that suggests the unseen providence of God behind the events of history here. There's also the theme of the believer and the world in Esther. On the positive side, Esther ultimately has the courage to risk her life and identify with her Jewish people. And Mordecai is an example of a law-abiding, good citizen Jew in the Persian Empire. Though on the negative side, Esther's ruthlessness, her compromise in marrying a pagan, and lack of any overt spirituality and piety seem to be negative aspects of her character. There's also the theme of the Feast of Purim. Purim celebrates God's deliverance of the Jews from genocide, and that is established in the book of Esther. Well, let me then return back to Ezra Nehemiah. A little bit about Ezra chapter 7 through 10, the second return from exile under Ezra. The second return was led by Ezra in 458 BC. Two major issues were addressed by Ezra. One, he was given the right to reinstitute the Mosaic law as the law of Judah, and he did that. He also dealt with the problem of mixed marriages where Jews were marrying foreign wives. A little bit about Ezra the man. His name means Yahweh helps. He was a scholar scribe skilled in the interpretation of Mosaic law. He was also a priest, and he was a man of action and a man of faith. And you see the latter in his prayer in Ezra chapter 9. Let me move on to the book of Nehemiah, the third return from exile. Nehemiah was the cupbearer of Artaxerxes I. He too was a man of prayer and action. He got the king to make him governor of Judah around 444 BC. And his main accomplishment was rebuilding the wall of Jerusalem over the course of about 52 days. And why was it important to rebuild the torn down walls of Jerusalem? Well, rebuilding it was a symbol of God's renewal of his holy city, the place of the temple. That would be an encouragement to the Jewish people. He had opponents: Sanballat, the governor of Samaria; Tobiah, the governor of the Ammonites. Nehemiah was a man who combined faith and action. And he also, like Ezra, dealt with the problem of mixed marriages. Well, what are some of the theological themes in Ezra and Nehemiah? One of the theological themes is the providence of God, that God stirred up the Persian king Cyrus for his purposes and allowed the Jewish people to return, just as he had prophesied in Jeremiah and other prophets. You also have the theme of God's continued covenant relationship with Israel. In accord with earlier prophecy and promises, God had not abandoned his people, but after the chastening of the exile, was in the process of restoring Israel. And it shows that God was in the process of fulfilling the promises from the exile down to the days of Ezra and Nehemiah, protecting his people physically. It's also a bit of remnant theology there, that God always preserves a remnant for his people, and it shows God's grace. Israel didn't deserve to have this covenant relationship with him, but God in his grace continued that relationship. A third theme is the centrality of worship for the people of God. Hence the theme of the restoration of the altar and temple worship with its rituals under the priests and Levites. This emphasis suggests that the author may have been a priest. Well, under the general rubric of worship, note the many prayers and confessions and worship and petitions, and it gives illustrations of how to pray and worship in these books. There's also the imperative to obey God's Torah and to maintain holiness among God's people. Failure to obey God's instruction had led to the exile. Now, especially under Ezra, there's a renewed emphasis on the law and obeying it. They were to demonstrate their separation to God, their holiness, by obedience to his law. And that teaches us the centrality of Scripture and the importance of it. Unfortunately, this does later on develop into the opposite error of legalism and letterism, though that was after Ezra's day. And then finally, we have the theme of the cooperation of man and God to accomplish the work of God. Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah show not just a otherworldly spirituality, but each one puts spirituality into practical effect. Not just prayers, but also bricks and mortar and ritual observance. It avoids the error of man proposes and God disposes, and the opposite error of God helps those that help themselves. There's a balance here between divine control and human initiative. It shows not prayer only, but also actions after prayer. You have that in Nehemiah, where they pray, but then they act. And it shows the need for godly leaders and united action by the people of God, both in building the temple and building the walls of Jerusalem, and yet trusting God for help in that work. So that's my introduction to Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. And my name is Dr. Joe Sprinkle.